Frontier last Saturday.
Yes, our last Saturday thing, I was reading from this book. This book is called, it doesn't actually say on the cover.
It doesn't have a title of it.
It has a cover, it just
is,
says it, yeah.
How to Be a Hero,
How to Be a Hero.
Volume 1, by the book.
By the book. And this is the preliminary copy. It's the only copy of this manuscript.
Unless Mishell has one.
Unless Mishell has one, which she might have because we printed out two. What it is the story of a very similar to the story of
I have a little blurb about that.
Quest for Glory. What it is a retelling of what might have happened, what the Quest for Glory game was really based upon. And instead of one hero, no, there wasn't just one hero. There were four. There were four brothers and a sister who...
Three brothers and a sister.
Three brothers and a sister.
Four siblings.
Four siblings, yes, who were in the little village of Alpendorf. They were orphans. And they were going to be separated because their caretaker, their keeper, was the healer of the town, and she has died, and now they were going to have to be put to work. And so that made the hero of this book particular is named Hawk. Hawk is the oldest, but he has a twin brother who is named Falcon. His middle brother is named Owl, and his youngest sister is named Wren. So those are your cast of characters. And in the last story, in the last chapter, Hawk helped rescue a gypsy boy and went to the gypsy camp and was given the choice of what prize he'd like to take home. And he took away a prize that was in a box, so he didn't know what was in the box. He took it all the way home, and when he brought it back to their place, they looked at it and found there was a book. And it was So You Want to Be a Hero, the correspondence school for heroes. And
How to Be a Hero.
How to Be a Hero. And so he decided at the end of chapter 1 that maybe he should read this book and maybe he could become a hero. And thus his adventures began. And so now, here we go. This is chapter 2, Path to Adventure. Adventure, Hawk soon discovered, bore a striking resemblance to hard work. The plan had seemed simple enough. After spending a night and day poring over his new book, Hawk had decided that the solution to his family's woes was for him to become an adventurer. The back pages of his new book contained a listing of adventurers' guilds, and which he'd scanned at first without much hope. Then, to his delight, he saw a listing for a guild in the barony of Siegburg. Although in Hawk's lifetime no one in Alpendorf had seen reason to make the trip, the town of Siegburg was little more than a day and a half down the mountain. If Hawk could return to Alpendorf by the quarter moon with a legitimate new way of supporting his family, even Falcon could be convinced that they'd be better off in Siegburg. However, Falcon was always the most difficult one to convince. This is why, upon leaving Alpendorf, Hawk had left a note instead of announcing his plans directly. Now, with 7 days to go until the quarter moon, Hawk was sore from his journey down the mountain and from shivering all night on the icy ground. He set his pain aside and clambered slowly up a pile of rocky debris that blocked the road, struggling with the awkward weight of his sword. It was an expertly wrought weapon, nearly 4 feet long, with rubies embedded in the hilted scabbard. It was an odd match for Hawk's brown woolens and clumsy boots, and he wasn't used to carrying it. After a few slides and stumbles, however, Hawk finally reached the top of the rock pile with the sword still in place. He stood for a moment to adjust the pack on his shoulders, and it was then that he saw the answer to his heart's desires beckoning over the treetops. Siegburg. The town of Siegburg was nestled among the new spring greens of the valley, surrounded on all sides by the snow-covered peaks of the Vulman Alps. Evergreen forests grew up thickly around the valley, broken here and there by patches of meadow that shone like emerald velvet in the cloudy noonday light. Because of the way Siegburg was built on the northern foothills, the entire town tilted towards him invitingly. Over Siegburg's triangle of sandstone walls, Hawk could see dozens of peaked reddish roofs and a single pointed bell tower reaching towards the mountain tops. Following the line of the tower further up the foothills, Hawk's heart stopped. A castle. A real castle. At least, he was fairly certain it was a castle. With trembling hands, Hawk reached into his rucksack and pulled out How to Be a Hero. Turning to page 16, Hawk compared the illustration to what he was seeing. Yes, it was a castle. Hawk put the book away and nearly tumbled headfirst into the rocks in his haste to be on his way. As he continued eastward, drawing nearer to the town, he saw fallow farmlands and barren fruit trees to the south. A crystalline stream from the southern forests flowed gently down in through the fields, then divided to encircle the town. Hawk had just paused for a moment to wonder why the stream seemed to be flowing uphill when he saw something streaking toward him out of the northern forests. It was a purplish reptilian biped, almost chest height, with a long whip-like tail and spindly forearms. In its jaws were the remains of a newborn goat. Hawk felt a rush of indignation at that sight. That goat undoubtedly represented a next year's meat or milk for some Siegburg family. He reached down in an attempt to draw his sword against the predator, but instead ended up rotating the scabbard a quarter turn around his waist and nearly fell over in the process. To make matters worse, Hawk's would-be quarry paused to watch the entertaining display. After a few more awkward lunges and a mental note to tighten his belt, Hawk managed to slide all 3.5 feet of blade out of its sheath. The creature cocked its head in surprise, then turned tail and ran. Feeling exhilarated and adventurous, Hawk gave chase, the hilt of his sword grasped firmly in both hands. As he sprinted into the forest north of the road, branches awkwardly slapped and scratched his face and arms. Meanwhile, his quarry seemed to slip in and out of the trees like a shaft of purple light. Slowly but surely, Hawk was losing ground. Then suddenly, the creature veered off at a right angle. Before Hawk could decide whether to follow, he saw what it had been avoiding. The monster was vaguely humanoid, around 8 feet tall, with huge fists that nearly dragged on the ground. Its ruddy, hairy form was crudely clothed, but its facial expression was utterly devoid of intelligence. It grimaced, showing an obscene number of jagged yellow teeth. Hawk came to a hard stop. He held his sword up in a threatening pose, but the monster continued to lurch toward him. To eat him, sword and all, no doubt. Before he quite realized it, Hawk found that his weapon had rattled its way back into its sheath. He turned and took off running the way he came. Unfortunately, the thing gave chase. Hawk's sword bounced awkwardly against his thigh, the end nearly dragging on the ground as if to remind him that such a weapon wasn't meant to be worn while running away. Hawk retraced his steps back to the road and followed it at full speed towards Siegburg, where he could see the gate stood open and unguarded. Hawk's boots pounded on the dirt road, his breath frosted in the chill air. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw that the monster had begun to drool as it heaved its huge body down the road after him. The road turned into a bridge where it crossed the stream, and Hawk nearly stumbled over the widely spaced slats. The monster was gaining on him. Behind him, it crossed the bridge as though it had done so 100 times. By the time Hawk reached the town gate, he had a stabbing pain in his side. He was sweating despite the cold, and his fair hair stuck to his forehead. Overall, he wasn't feeling very heroic. A pot-bellied old man dressed in fine clothes sat on the porch just across from the gate, smoking a pipe and watching Hawk from a rough-hewn rocker. Hawk glanced backwards towards the town gate and saw that the monster was still coming. "Close the gate!" Hawk cried loud to the top of the town wall, although he could see no guards patrolling there. "A monster is heading this way!" No one seemed to hear him but the old man, who just pulled on his pipe and smiled faintly under his enormous gray mustache. "Sir," Hawk said as he tried to catch his breath, "go inside, there's a monster." "Is there now?" replied the old man, stroking his mustache with a vague expression. Just then Hawk heard the wheezing gasps of the monster as it lumbered in through the open gate. There was nothing left to do. If Hawk continued running, the beast might go after the old man. He'd have to stay and fight. It was a shame he hadn't managed to get in at least one sword lesson first. Hawk remembered this time to hold firmly onto his scabbard with one hand. Then slowly he drew his sword with the other. The light caught on the blade, which glimmered almost white in the noonday sun. Hawk turned and faced the beast, jeweled hilt feeling cold against his sweaty palms. He was either about to do something very heroic or die horribly. In either event, he was going to have a witness. "Stop!" said the old man suddenly, in a tone that drew Hawk up short. "Otto, come here!" The monster looked over at the old man and slumped. Hawk watched in astonishment as the huge beast trudged up the porch steps to stand beside the old man. "Otto, sit!" said the old man, pointing to a nearby oversized rocker. Otto sat. Hawk realized belatedly that he was standing with his mouth open and that the old man was laughing. Hawk stiffened, still gripping his sword. He wasn't used to being laughed at. "Never seen a gun before, have you?" said the old man. Hawk shook his head. "Well, don't let Otto scare you. He's not very bright, but he does know how to chase what runs." "Tag," grunted Otto, or something very much like it. Tag. The creature's mouth opened in a wide grin, and it pulled out a wooden top out of the pouch at its side. Carefully, he began to wrap the string around it. Hawk felt his ears turning red as he slowly slid his sword back into the sheath. How much dumber could he possibly look? Part of him, not the heroic part, wanted to crawl back up the mountain the way he'd come. "I'm Hawk," he said hurriedly to fill in the silence. "Do you happen to know where I can find the Adventurers Guild Hall?" The old man gave him an appraising look, then blew a pair of smoke rings. "I am Schultz Meisterson," he said. "You look a little young for an adventurer, Hawk. What are you, 15? 16, said Hawk, "I think." Meisterson gave him a quizzical look, and Hawk's flush deepened. He wasn't about to explain his dubious origins. "If you don't mind, sir, I'd like directions to the guild."
Stream is disconnected. Attempting to reconnect. Okay, we have reconnected. We did have a stream problem there. We need to back up a little.
Okay, how far?
I don't know. Where were you? Where are you?
Where am I? How many lines?
Well, just tell me where you are. Point.
Thing.
16. Okay, let's go all the way back to Hawk shook his head.
All right.
Backing up to.
Okay, fine. Yes, we had a little trouble on our end, too. Okay.
Yeah, and I have closed my Chrome browser because I have had problems on this computer before with Chrome deciding to take over the entire thing.
"I'm Hawk," he said hurriedly to fill in the silence. "Do you happen to know where I can find the Adventurers Guild Hall?" The old man gave him an appraising look, then blew a pair of smoke rings. "I am Schultz Meisterson," he said. "You look a bit young for an adventurer, Hawk. What are you, 15? 16, said Hawk. "I think." Meisterson gave him a quizzical look, and Hawk's blush deepened. He wasn't about to explain his dubious origins. "If you don't mind, sir, I'd like directions to the guild. I've walked quite a long way to find it." The old man gave him a once-over, his eyes going hard. Wren, I wager, he observed. That fancy sword of yours doesn't quite match your boots. Hawk bristled at the implication. It's mine, and it took me a day and a half to get here, so I'd really like... A day and a half? Let's see. You must have come from Alpendorf. That's right, said Hawk in surprise. Otto got out of his chair, and Hawk watched him uneasily. The goon just sat down on the steps and started to pull some skittle pins from his pouch at his side. People in Alpendorf aren't known for their weapons, the old man persisted, his gaze never leaving Hawk's. I've had this thing since I was born. I don't know where it came from, honestly. Something in Hawk's face must have reassured the old man, because he settled back into his chair and took another pull on the pipe. You didn't meet any trouble coming down the western road, did you? He said. Brigands sometimes camp out there. I didn't run into anyone, said Hawk, other than Otto and some sort of purple lizard-like thing. At this, the old man gave a growl. Damnable loafers, he said. They'd snatch a baby out of its cradle if you gave 'em half a chance. He paused, frowning at Hawk. This is a very dangerous place, and loafers are the least of it. Take my advice. Forget about the Adventurers Guild. Forget about it? Said Hawk in astonishment. He shook his head fiercely. It's all I've been able to think about for 3 days. I slept on the ground last night, nearly burned my hair off on the campfire, and I don't have a lot of time, so if you won't help me, then I'll just find the guild myself. So saying, Hawk turned around. He had never been in anything as magnificent and confusing as Siegburg in all his life. Tall, narrow, half-timbered buildings in cheerful colors crowded themselves over crooked cobblestone streets and alleyways. The gate he'd passed through seemed to be situated at one point of a triangle. Hawk picked a promising-looking road that angled off to the left. You won't find it that way, Meisterson called out from his porch. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. Hawk turned, irritated. Just leave off, all right? It's none of your business of what I do, anyway. Meisterson blew a smoke ring, seemingly unperturbed. There you are wrong, my boy. It is my business. I happen to be the sheriff of this town. He tapped his chest. Embroidered upon the man's chest was an insignia Hawk should have recognized. Hawk's face blushed crimson, and he once again couldn't speak. He just told the sheriff of Siegburg to leave off. Hawk hung his head, his cheeks burning. I'm sorry, he said. I guess Otto has better manners than me. It's just that I've come this far. Meisterson softened a bit. That's all right, he said. I was once a young boy, too, with dreams of adventure. If it's the guild hall you want, it's just up the main street here. You can't get in too much trouble if you stay in town. But don't go wandering outside. Once you've seen the guild hall, I suggest you go along home. There's more enough adventure for you, and you'll be alive to tell your family about it. Thank you, sir, Hawk said politely. He couldn't blame the sheriff for being so cautious. The sheriff probably didn't have a How to Be a Hero manual. Hawk turned and started up the main road, which angled off to the right of the sheriff's porch. Meanwhile, Otto had set up the last of the skittle pins in a triangular shape of Siegburg. Placing the top in front of the pins, Otto pulled the string and sent them spinning furiously. Otto grinned as the pins scattered in every direction. That music behind us. Hawk shook his head. Of course the sheriff would have a goon working for him. Page 32 of How to Be a Hero talked about goons. They were like big, ugly guard dogs. If Hawk had been paying attention, he might have figured things out before he made a fool of himself in front of the town sheriff. He'd have to be more observant from now on. With that idea in mind, he looked around as he walked. So this was Siegburg. Hawk had heard stories about the town from the elders of Alpendorf. Siegburg was on the major trade route to the east, and as the stories had said, the town alone was bigger than Alpendorf and its farmlands put together. Siegburg's main road was lined with brightly painted shops, signs hanging over the doors to show what was sold within. Hawk recognized the guild immediately. It looked like the illustration in his book. The sign above the door bore an emblem of crossed swords, and below were the words Adventurers Guild Hall in 3 languages, 2 of which he could actually read. Hawk's stomach gave a little quiver despite his weariness. "This is it," he said, laying a hand gently on the pommel of his sword. His life as an adventurer was about to begin. Sword lessons, monster hunting, and sipping ale by the fire with his peers. He'd never actually tried ale before, but it was right there on page 6 of the How to Be a Hero, so he supposed he'd have to acquire a taste for it. He pushed open the heavy oaken door and entered the fire-lit hall. The interior was just as well maintained as the exterior, with the requisite trophy heads mounted on every wall. Hawk looked around at the once fearsome creatures in awe, recognizing a Loffer immediately. Each head had the name of a monster and the name of a hunter who had killed it. Smiling, Hawk saw an empty spot in the wall, where his own name might soon be displayed. At the moment, however, this place seemed to be mostly empty of adventurers. It was just afternoon, so Hawk supposed they'd all be out adventuring. But where was the guildmaster? The door creaked as it shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the high timbered ceiling. The room was lit by the flickering candles on an ancient chandelier, and warmed by a large stone fireplace with a huge bear's pelt stretched out before it. The place smelled of wood smoke and animal hide. An extremely short, gray-bearded man sat snoring loudly in the leather armchair by the fire. Hawk approached and cleared his throat politely, but the man snored on. Hawk moved closer to the man's ear and cleared his throat again, a little louder. The stocky little man started awake, rubbed his hands on his knees, and looked around. Hawk by this time had retreated back to a respectful distance. "Hello, hello," the man said with a slightly creaky voice. "I was so busy I did not see you come in." "Are you the guildmaster?" Hawk said dubiously, judging by the man's stature and thick beard. He was probably a dwarf. Hawk had heard about dwarves, but none had ever come to Alpendorf. "Yeah, that's right," said the little man. "I am Wolfgang Abentur, and I'm the guildmaster here." Hawk grinned, extending his hand. "I'm Hawk. I'm here to join the guild." Wolfgang looked Hawk up and down much the same way the sheriff had, then gave Hawk's hand a brief, lackluster shake. "Have you done much adventuring?" "Not really," Hawk admitted. Wolfgang scratched his beard. "Well, boy, I'm afraid Siegburg isn't the best place to learn." "What do you mean?" "It wasn't always so," said Wolfgang sadly. "I am all that is left of the Adventurers Guild in Siegburg now. But, well, I recall the time." Hawk's jaw dropped. "This is it? This is the entire Adventurers Guild?" "Yeah," Wolfgang said with a nod. "So maybe you are better off finding somewhere else to learn adventuring." Hawk felt like he'd swallowed a stone. "I barely had enough food to make it here." "Oh, you can still get food here in town. It's not that bad. Yet. If you want to stay the night, the Hero's Tale Inn is still open. Keep down this road and turn left when you get to town square. You can repurchase these supplies from the merchants in the center for your journey back." Hawk didn't have anything to trade, but he didn't feel like mentioning that. Instead, he drew his sword and held it out for Wolfgang's inspection. "Before I go home, I intend to use this weapon to earn myself a position as an adventurer. Wolfgang just blinked. It is indeed a fine sword you have, and I have seen a lot of swords. But a blade isn't everything. You have to know when you've stumbled into danger more than you can handle. Of course, no one listens to me anymore. I'll be careful, said Hawk reassuringly. I'll start with something easy if you like. What's the easiest monster to kill around here? A loafer, probably, Wolfgang said. However, they are hard to catch, and the bounty isn't worth the trouble. More likely you'll get caught out there by a pack of dire wolves, or a troll, or that nasty kobold that's been wandering around town. Don't worry, Hawk said, grinning. I'm a born fighter. As a child, I drove off wolves with nothing but stones. Well, if you are looking for work, said Wolfgang, they always need strong men at the castle. The castle. It was too good to be true. Hawk slid his sword back into his jeweled scabbard with a grin. Wolfgang began to nod again. Either he was satisfied, or he was falling back to sleep. You go to the castle. You get yourself a job. You'll be okay, huh? It's just not a good idea to try to be an adventurer right now here. All the same, said Hawk, I'd like to sign in. I know the rules. You have a logbook around here somewhere, don't you? Wolfgang just grunted. Yeah, perhaps you should read the logbook. See how many adventurers have come here, and how many have died. He pointed with one stubby finger to the table by the fire. Hawk rushed over, flipped open the first blank page, and took the dusty quill out of the inkwell. Fortunately, not all the ink had dried up. He signed his name triumphantly. That alone was something the rest of Alpendorf couldn't do. After adding a few underlines and a final flourish, Hawk replaced the quill. I'll be back, he promised. Then he was out the door before the old man could protest. Hawk was flooded with elation the moment he left the hall. Now he was an official adventurer with a quest to pursue. 3 quests, in fact. First, he should find a place to spend the night, and second, go to the castle for a job. After that, he should go back to the guild hall and find out more about Siegburg's troubles. How to be a hero specifically stated that the first step to becoming an adventurer was to sign the logbook, and the second was to ask questions, a lot of them. First things first, Hawk needed somewhere to stay at the night. What did Wolfgang call the place? The Hero's Tail Inn. Hawk smiled. That had to be a good omen. The Hero's Tail Inn stood, as Wolfgang had said, along the perimeter of a huge circle of cobblestones that surrounded the well at the center of the town. A few merchants gathered at the other end of the town center, attempting to peddle their scant wares to the handful of passer-bys. Glancing around at the sound of their shouts, Hawk stopped and stood for a moment in shock. Behind them stood the charred wreckage of a building. Whoever had destroyed the structure had done so with such violence that dingy pieces of rose-colored plaster were still scattered all over the town center. The 2 buildings nestled close on either side had also been heavily damaged by the flames and flying timbers, but their signs still waved in the smoke-scented breeze, blackened but intact. Hawk's eyes lingered on the destruction for a moment. But on the near side of the town center, the single candle in the window of the Hero's Tail Inn beckoned like a song of the Lorelei. Hawk brushed the dust from his ragged wool clothes, readjusted the jeweled scabbard at his left hip, and entered the inn. It was almost uncomfortably warm inside. The place looked just like an illustration in Chapter 2 of How to Be a Hero. Ornamental dishes on display, heavy beams on the ceiling, and a few long tables for drinking and dining. Waiting by the fireplace, however, was the strangest creature Hawk had ever seen. It looked for all the world like a cinnamon-colored cat standing on 2 legs, scarcely taller than the dwarven guildmaster. Over its silken fur, it wore a colorfully embroidered vest and a strange pair of trousers that ballooned elegantly at the cuffs. Pressing its hands together, it bowed deeply. It had 4 furry fingers and a thumb, which Hawk stared at in fascination. "Greetings," it purred, twitching its black-tipped ears. "You are most welcome at the Hero's Tell Inn." Hawk was too shocked to speak. The creature had spoken in Silmarian, the language of travelers, diplomats, spellcasters, and educated men. Hawk had always known Silmarian nearly as well as he knew the local tongue, although he really wasn't quite sure why. Certainly no one else in the village besides his family had ever spoken. "I am Shamin of the Cat people," the cat continued. "I am your host. Together with my wife Shima, I will provide you with the finest of hospitality. Come in, sit down, and be at rest." That much Hawk could manage. He eased his aching body into one of the oaken chairs, finding it surprisingly comfortable. While his wits returned to him, he cleared his throat and spoke. "I'm Hawk," he said in Cimmerian. "I'm an adventurer. Wolfgang at the Guildhall said I could stay here. The softest of beds and the finest of foods await your every desire," Shamin said with another bow. He then clapped his strange hands together again. "Shima!" he called out. "Come and meet our guest." From the back, a female cat appeared, carrying a brass tea service. Luminous turquoise eyes and black-tipped golden ears were visible above the sheer veil that covered most of her face. She wore a short vest over translucent sleeves and the pants of deep blue trimmed with gold. On her slender midriff, shockingly, she wore nothing but soft, pale golden fur. Hawk found himself staring and then quickly looked away. She was a cat, for heaven's sakes. A married cat. "This is she," Shamin said proudly. "My Shima, the most beautiful treasure in all of the desert lands." "Desert lands?" Hawk repeated. He glanced out the window pointedly. Last time he checked, Siegburg Valley was rather on the damp side. Shamin seemed almost to smile, as though it was difficult to tell. "We are from the lands of Shapir," he said, as Shima shyly poured Hawk a cup of tea. "It is a distant paradise of warm sands and golden sun, very unlike this place of bitter cold and snow," he added, his whiskers drooping slightly. Hawk took his first sip of the sweet minty tea and smiled with pleasure. He thought he remembered hearing stories of Shapir from Owl. "Could I take a short nap here?" Hawk asked Shamin, overtaken by a sudden yawn. The stifling air of the inn was making him sleepy. "Certainly," said Shamin. "You have but to offer 5 monda, and then I will lead you to the bliss of sleep." "5 what?" "The price of a room for the night, O master." Hawk stared at the cat as in dismay. It hadn't occurred to him that he'd have to pay to sleep. What kind of place was this? There's a bit of a problem," said Hawk. "I don't exactly have 5 of those." Shamin bowed deeply. "I am happy to bargain with you, young master." Hawk just stared at the cat for a moment. He slipped the pack off his shoulders and turned it upside down on the table. A change of clothes fell out, along with a bedraggled hen feather, a few breadcrumbs, and his tattered copy of How to Be a Hero. The book looked old and tired in the light of the fire. "What you see here," Hawk said, laying his hand protectively over the book, "plus the sword at my side, are all I own." Shamin's whiskers quivered, and his ears flickered backwards for a moment. "My deepest regrets, young master, but an inn must require payment of its patrons, or it ceases to be an inn." "You're going to turn me away?" Hawk said in amazement. "I slipped on the ground last night and I nearly froze to death. I can't do that again." Shamin turned to his wife and spoke to her urgently in the musical language that Hawk couldn't understand. Shima said nothing, only looked back at Shamin with large, sad blue eyes. She shook her head slightly.
Don't worry, only 73 more pages to go.
I am sorry, Shamin said to Hawk, but we have suffered great misfortune and cannot afford to be generous at this time. But I'm an adventurer, Hawk said. I'm on my way to the castle to find work. I'll pay you back soon, I promise. Again, Shamin turned to his wife, and again she shook her head, although her eyes seemed almost tearful. Shamin looked stricken as he turned again to Hawk. Please forgive us, but we must insist. If you could offer us but a few coins, we would be happy to let you stay. Hawk stared at his tea. So Manda were coins, then? All right, he said. Are Manda hard to come by? Shamin brightened. 5 Manda is but a trifle, he purred. With your strong shoulders and your fine sword, you will be showered with silver before nightfall, and then we can treat you as one of our family. Hawk thought longingly of what it would feel like to sleep in a real bed, a pleasure he had never really experienced. And there was something soothing about the caddis, their silent feet and graceful movements. This would be a nice place to stay. For now, Shamin said cheerfully, you may finish your tea and share the warmth of our fire. The warmth of the fire was starting to be a bit much for Hawk, actually. He felt a rivulet of sweat run down his spine. He set down his teacup, stood, and bowed to Shamin. Your offer is kind, he said, but I should see about getting some of those Manda. I'll be right back. The Caddis both bowed deeply to him in farewell, and he left the inn. The cold outside hit him with a shock after the stifling heat of the innkeeper's fireplace. The sun was well past its zenith. The bitter cold, combined with the dampness of sweat, made Hawk shiver violently. All the same, he had to find a way to get 5 Manda, and fast. And that is Chapter 2.